Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Nicole Gurran, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, and I'm also the Director of the University's Henry Halloran Research Trust, which supports research and informed dialogue on cities and regions. But before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are here on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And given that we're talking housing tonight, I'd particularly like to acknowledge the tireless and ongoing work in advocating for Aboriginal housing by our Aboriginal leaders, particularly in the local area, but also more widely in Australia. And of course, housing justice in Australia must confront the foundational displacement and the ongoing impacts of colonisation. Having said that, Australia's housing system appears to be at a real crossroads. The State of the Nation's Housing Report, released yesterday, has a number of grim and alarming statistics. It very conservatively estimates that anywhere between 377,000 households, and add to that another 570,000 households are in some type of rental stress, including 208,000 households in extreme rental stress. They're counting nearly 50,000 households experiencing homelessness in Australia, and a number of other grim and alarming data that unfortunately you in this room are all too familiar with. But of course we have a new Commonwealth government who have signalled something that we would all welcome. They've signalled a national approach once more to leadership in the housing space, with a new national housing and homelessness plan on the agenda, resurrecting the independent national housing supply and adding the word affordability into that independent council's title. We've got a rather enigmatic, I would say, a housing accord between the states, Commonwealth and local government and industry. So we're yet to see what that's going to deliver, but it sounds exciting. There's somewhat stalled, but still fingers crossed for the Housing Australia Futures Fund to deliver a real injection of money for new social and affordable housing supply, and let's see where negotiations around that end up. And of course in New South Wales we've got our own new government, and I think all we can say at this point is that hopes are very high for a more strategic and a more ambitious approach to housing policy in this state. And yet we do still seem bogged down, especially if we read the current media coverage. We still seem bogged down, I would say, by a lack of real ideas for change in Australia. I think we're still falling back on the cliches around NIMBYism and planning reform, calling for changes that are long enacted and turning our back on changes that are seen to be politically unfeasible. So it's certainly the perfect time to turn our sights to other places and take a bigger picture view about changing housing policy and the constraints and the opportunities that might be facing governments in a time of global poverty and rising inequality. Which brings us to our speaker. Mark Stevens is the Ian McTaggart Chair in Land, Property and Urban Studies at the University of Glasgow, and I'm very delighted to say that he's visiting professor here in the School of Architecture, Planning and Design at the University of Sydney. His research interests, and he is very familiar to most of you in the audience of course, but his research interests include the study of housing systems and their relationship with wider social and economic institutions. Much of his research uses international comparisons and he led the European Union study on housing and exclusion. Now, like us here at the Henry Halloran Research Trust, Mark is passionate about enhancing the relationship between academic research and expertise, as well as policy making and, of course, industry. And a special welcome to those of you from the policy and industry communities who are joining us tonight, as well as, of course, those of you from the community more widely. Mark is currently lead editor of the Chartered Institute of Housing's annual UK Housing Review, which has been described as the housing sector's Bible and essential encyclopedia. So we'll all be looking that up, Mark. Mark's going to talk for about 25 minutes, and we are going to be treated to a research-based scholarly conversation, and I think that's what we all need at the moment. But then we're going to open it up to your questions, possibly comments, mostly questions. Thanks to those of you who've submitted questions in advance to get the ball rolling, but do think about whether there's something special that you'd like to ask Mark tonight. And then we'll adjourn the conversation at about 5:10 for the customary reception, which is outside the canteen. And there is actually another housing event on here this evening in the schools, so make plans to stick around if you're at all able to do so. But with that, over to Mark.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to deliver this lecture. I'd like to thank the University of Sydney for hosting me during my period of study leave, and the Henry Halloran Research Trust for facilitating this event. The pandemic, which so abruptly halted exchanges such as this, also demanded levels of government support and social cohesion that few people have experienced outside wars. This briefly gave rise to the hope that we might build back better, learning not only that collective action can be good for us all, but that we should be kinder and more understanding of one another. And the underlying motive for the theme of this lecture, Housing System Change Explored Internationally, is to help us to understand how housing systems operate and consequently to facilitate discussion about what might make them work better. So let me begin by outlining what I mean by a housing system. For me, it is a range of institutions that influence the ways in which people are housed and how housing is used. These may be thought of as operating in three spheres: the sphere of production or supply, the sphere of consumption, which includes tenure arrangements, and the sphere of exchange or finance. There is, in principle, a plethora of possibilities, particularly when state and market institutions, as well as households, are all actors across each of the three domains. Dynamic interrelationships are therefore an inherent part of housing systems, which are not fully captured when the efficiency of individual markets are examined in isolation. But possibilities also imply boundaries or limitations, and many of these boundaries are set by the context in which housing systems operate. And now I should like to discuss these contexts. The 3 decades following the Second World War, les Trente Glorieuses, as the French call them, saw a set of international economic institutions established that facilitated and regulated trade, but nonetheless allowed national governments to operate fiscal and monetary policy in such a way as to maintain full employment and steady levels of economic growth. This also allowed countries to develop their own distinctive institutional arrangements governing labour markets and how they chose to redistribute labour market income through tax and social security arrangements. This set of institutions can be thought of as a welfare system. And the way in which these welfare systems were configured had distinctive distributional outcomes. That is, they impacted on levels of income inequality and poverty. So let us take 2 contrasting examples. In the United States, there were considerable barriers to creating the kind of social protection systems that were developed in other advanced economies. Political culture was more individualistic. The Constitution was designed to limit presidential powers, whilst racism and the legacy of slavery erected another barrier. So even after Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty in the 1960s, there was and never has been a comprehensive income safety net in the United States. An economy that generates great wealth has always divided it very unevenly. At the other end of the spectrum sat Sweden. Sweden developed a quite different model which stood out even among the other social democracies. Building on an historic agreement between trade unions and employers, a form of corporatism that sought to compress wage differentials and contained wage increases to encourage reinvestment and productivity growth was developed and for a while was successful. Alongside it, the better-known systems of generous social security benefits and universal services were developed during the 3 decades of uninterrupted Social Democratic Party government. Poverty rates in Sweden, according to the OECD, were below 4% in the 1980s. It's not surprising, therefore, that quite different housing systems were developed within these contrasting contexts. Public housing was developed in the United States, but it was outside the market, limited to people who could not secure adequate housing without substantial assistance. Hence, the main thrust of policy was to promote the American dream of home ownership through a regulated mortgage finance system backed by state guarantees through the Federal Housing Agency. Within its own terms, this policy was successful, driving up the home ownership rate, but equally through discriminatory underwriting criteria, excluding much of the black population, so reinforcing residential segregation. In Sweden, unsurprisingly, a radically different housing system was created. A state-subsidised house-building policy, known as the Million Homes Programme, ran between the mid-1960s and mid-1970s. It was led by municipal housing companies, although the principle of tenure neutrality meant that private landlords could also receive support. The private rented sector was initially subject to rent controls, but these gave way to a system whereby rents were negotiated locally between the Tenants' Federation and the municipal housing companies, and these were used for the basis of setting rents in the for-profit sector. It became a point of principle that municipal housing was open to everyone, regardless of income, so much so that Swedes still vehemently reject the application of the term social housing to its municipal housing sector. I was once invited to talk to housing practitioners in Sweden, and having patiently listened to me speaking in English, the participants went into discussion groups. And in these groups, the only English words I heard were social housing. The concept so alien that the Swedish language would not be employed to dignify it with its own vocabulary. Meanwhile, under the auspices of Christian rather than social democracy, Germany also developed a housing system in which the market was shaped by the state, but the state did not attempt to replace it. Germany's social market economy regulated labour markets, supported corporatist wage bargaining, but was more conservative than in Sweden in maintaining the male breadwinner model and less redistributive through its social insurance system. Extensive subsidies for the house building were essential given the extent of wartime destruction and the need to house millions of refugees, and they were available across the board. Municipalities, public and private sector employers, as well as trade unions all built social housing. But so did private landlords, who were required to set rent on social terms, at least until their subsidised loan had been repaid. As shortages were met on an area-by-area basis, harder forms of rent control gave way to weaker forms of rent regulation, combined with tenure security. The ambition was to create a single rental market shaped but not dominated by the state. The result was a housing system where many people chose renting over owning. Now, in each of these examples, the housing systems were embedded within the welfare systems. So if we are to look for explanations of housing system change, we must also examine how welfare systems evolved. Systems of economic governance seem to work until they don't. And the breakdown of the post-war economic system and its replacement with a more globalized one came in several stages. First, the rise in inflation arising from the Vietnam War and the oil price shocks of the 1970s provoked economic crises that demanded action and shifted economic ideology towards favoring market-based solutions. Second, the collapse of the Soviet Union served to reinforce the Washington Consensus, the belief in the overriding efficacy of markets that came to dominate international institutions such as the World Bank. Third, the opening up of China brought with it a plentiful supply of cheap goods and what Manuel Albers has called a global wall of money. A particular effect of these changes was to induce an era of low interest rates and interconnected finance markets. The latter occurred as advanced economies conformed to the new consensus of charging central banks with targeting consumer price, but not asset inflation, and setting interest rates accordingly. So let us return to Sweden and Germany to see how these developments interacted with changes in the welfare and housing systems. Sweden, along with the other Nordic countries, chose to deregulate its finance system in the 1980s. That they were in the first wave of countries to deregulate their finance system is perhaps surprising. However, deregulation had far-reaching consequences for Sweden's social and economic model that was already under strain. As in other countries, the sudden increase in the availability of credit caused an unsustainable house price boom. In Finland, the illustrative, if not especially funny joke, was that a man went into a bank to shelter from the rain and came out with a mortgage. In what should have been a warning to the rest of the world, the subsequent crash in the early 1990s brought about a full-scale banking crisis, necessitating bank rescues, debt forgiveness, and the establishment of a bad bank to carry loans that would never be repaid. As unemployment rose, it also signalled the end to Sweden's unique economic model. Key institutions, such as collective wage agreements, were watered down, competitive devaluations were abandoned, fiscal consolidation and inflation targeting with central bank independence came in. Labour markets were deregulated and social security, whilst remaining generous by international standards, was cut back. High levels of employment have returned, but poverty and inequality have risen. What has happened in the Swedish housing system is intriguing. In the 1990s, subsidies for municipal housing companies were withdrawn, and levels of building slumped. And as we have seen, the mortgage finance system was deregulated. Combined with a reform that allowed shares in apartments in the owner cooperative sector to be freely traded on the market, mortgaged home ownership rose and became the tenure of choice. Sweden is now one of the most highly mortgaged countries in the world, and mortgaged home ownership the majority tenure. Yet many of the institutions of the social democratic era have been maintained. Rents are still negotiated, with the for-profit landlords now part of the negotiations. There are acute shortages, particularly in the large cities, and there is now a well-established secondary market in rent-controlled flats, sublet, sometimes illegally, and often at market rents. Meanwhile, a decade ago, with poverty and inequality rising, the municipal housing companies had to make an important decision. European Union competition law suggested that if they were to maintain below market rents, they would need to start limiting access in favour of poorer households. The municipal housing companies responded by reiterating their support for housing for all. Except many of them made it more difficult for poorer households to access the sector, with demands for references regarding behaviour and rent payment records. Some have even turned their noses up at applicants who receive the means-tested housing allowance. To make it more complicated, social work departments, who have responsibility for homelessness, lease apartments from municipal housing companies, which in turn squeezes out middle-income groups, encouraging them to become homeowners. No wonder Brett Christophers borrowed Jane Jacobs' phrase, monstrous hybrid, to characterise the modern Swedish housing system. In Germany, too, perceived economic failure, if not crisis, in the 1990s prompted change. It seems that the German Social Democrats had, as the economist Paul Krugman put it, joined the many people on both sides of the Atlantic who believe the United States has achieved low unemployment by a sort of devil's bargain, whose price is soaring inequality and growing poverty. A government committee chaired by a former chief executive of Volkswagen, Peter Hartz, resulted in wide-ranging changes to the social and economic model that, to simplify, moved towards a less regulated labour market and a shift towards social assistance, resulting in the creation of so-called mini-jobs, higher levels of employment, especially female employment, but also a trend towards higher levels of in-work poverty. The housing system too has evolved, mirroring some of these changes in the wider welfare institutions. The federal government has made various attempts to withdraw from responsibility for housing since the late 1980s and devolve it to the states. The pressures of unification in 1990 and the refugee crisis in 2015 prevented this, but suffice to say the era of sustained major subsidy is over. Under budgetary pressure, some municipalities, including Berlin and Dresden, sold part or all of their housing stocks to international investors in the 1990s and 2000s. Some 1.5 million units were lost in this way. With low levels of subsidy and hence new investment, the social rented sector has shrunk further as properties owned by private landlords shift into the market sector as subsidised loans are paid off. The weakened influence of social housing has combined with population pressures to place upward pressure on rents. The social market's effectiveness has declined, leading to a reversion to stricter forms of rent controls. The shortages have become more acute. The remaining social landlords have increased the targeting of allocations. Nonetheless, an interesting part of the German system is what has not changed. Whereas Sweden shifted towards a housing system where mortgaged ownership has become the largest tenure, Germany has maintained its status as a rental society. Security and moderated costs for established tenants remain attractive, even to many people who could afford to buy. Germany did not deregulate its housing finance system as the English-speaking and Nordic countries did. However, if the demand was there, foreign banks could offer larger mortgages under the terms of the European single market, which has been in place for 3 decades. So it seems there is a lack of appetite for acquiring debt associated with a greater aversion to risk. Now, the aversion to mortgage debt that is present in some countries is something that some people find difficult to believe, particularly in the Anglosphere. Much emphasis was placed by the World Bank and other Western advisors on the creation of mortgage systems in the formerly communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Yet these countries have become super home ownership states, that is, with ownership levels over 80 or even 90%, largely without mortgages. Jane Zawiska, an economic sociologist, found that when interviewing ordinary Russians about mortgages, the term Kabala was frequently employed. And Kabala means debt bondage. So it seems that an American's dream of home ownership with a mortgage is a Russian's nightmare of debt bondage. I debated this point with an American economist who had been a key advisor to the former communist countries in the 90s, who replied incredulously, And now you're telling me that these people don't want mortgages. Well, they sure do where I come from. On this last point, he was undoubtedly right. But the US subprime crisis, of course, provides the exemplar warning about over-egging access to mortgage finance as a means to open up home ownership to previously excluded groups. The context was one of widening inequality from an already high base, stagnant incomes at the lower end of the income spectrum, and in President Clinton's words, ending welfare as we know it. The system that evolved was one whereby subprime lending was to be maintained by ever-rising house prices until default rates reached such levels that the whole pack of cards collapsed. Using home ownership to alleviate the pain of persistently low incomes turned out to be a dangerous illusion. Moreover, in a globalized financial system, the risks were distributed around the world, culminating in the global financial crisis. But what is striking about the post-financial crisis experience has been how we have drifted into a new political economy of housing, especially in countries where home ownership was, until relatively recently, a realizable aspiration for most of the population. Central banks cut interest rates aggressively in response to the 2008 financial crisis and adopted quantitative easing, that is, purchasing bonds from banks to free up capital to encourage lending in order to support asset prices. We moved from low to ultra-low interest rates, which were then maintained throughout the long decade from the financial crisis to the COVID pandemic. In the UK, one effect of this policy was to prevent the kind of house price correction that we might have expected after the financial crisis. So whilst prices initially fell from their 2007 peak, the affordability that had been lost and was squeezing younger households out of home ownership before the financial crisis was never recovered. As one senior figure in the mortgage industry told me, if prices had been allowed to fall further, we would have rebased affordability better. The UK government's subsequent response to the affordability problem has been to adopt demand-side approaches which place upward pressure on prices. Policies include preferential rates of stamp duty for first-time buyers and the Help to Buy shared equity loan scheme, which for the first time gave the government a direct stake in protecting house prices. Whilst evaluations suggest the scheme opened up home ownership to few who would not have been able to do so without support. It certainly helped the house builders. Help to Buy accounted for between 1/3 and 1/2 of sales of the 5 of the 6 largest house builders. Yet the house builders responded to the crisis by adopting risk-averse policies and managed build-out rates, again to protect prices. The government adopted an ambitious supply target, but this has remained at best aspirational. It's always easier to analyse problems than identify solutions, but I will end by making some observations about the role of policy. These observations are generic, that is not aimed at any particular country, but I know that some of these will resonate with debates that are going on here in Australia. So first we need to think about income poverty and inequality. Housing systems have changed, partly because poverty and income inequality have risen in many countries. This both limits the choices of the poor, enhances housing consumption among the rich, and places additional pressures on central rented sectors. Yet there are some countries which have avoided these trends, so Krugman's devil's bargain is at least navigable. Moreover, there remain significant differences in the levels of poverty and inequality between countries. Raising social assistance benefit rates, which are often inadequate, is a starting point, although enhancing housing allowances, that is benefits like rent assistance, would target housing-induced poverty directly. Second, we should at least think about the role of monetary policy. We've seen that central banks have targeted consumer price inflation, but allowed asset prices, including housing, to soar. In 2021, the New Zealand government added house prices to the Reserve Bank's inflation mandate, suggesting that this might dampen, quote, investor demand and improve affordability for first-time home buyers. However, the bank's governor made no secret of his opposition to this initiative, claiming that it would make monetary policy less effective. We will, he said, be considering our financial stability policy settings via our prudential tools, like loan-to-value ratios, bank stress testing, and capital requirements. This is done with a view to moderating housing demand, particularly from investors, to best ensure house price stability. Third, housing supply should be thought of in the round. That is more broadly than house building rates alone. This concerns the distribution of housing consumption and the use for which it is employed. Houses purchased by overseas investors and kept empty are a relatively easy target. Housing under-occupied by home owners is much more difficult, but is something that needs to be discussed and of course relates to property taxation. Fourth, we should consider what role social renting might play. The experiences of some European countries show how a social rented sector can become part of the mainstream housing market. This requires a long-term commitment to invest in the sector so that it may begin to house a wider spectrum of the population and eventually become part of the mainstream market. In Scotland, what is thought of as being politically possible has shifted in the last decade. The right to buy policy of discounted sales of public housing to social tenants has been ended without political fallout, and a 5-year 50,000 unit affordable homes target reached. A commitment to build at a higher rate extends over the next decade, although is already under pressure from rising building costs. Fifth, some form of rent regulation is already proving to be irresistible in many jurisdictions, despite economists' general scepticism. Germany has long operated a system of moderating rent increases within existing tenancies, which are secure. But growing pressures caused an extension of controls to new contracts after 2015, which limited rents to 10% over comparable local rents. It is a form of market dampening rather than market denial that might characterize rent caps. Sixth, in terms of policy instruments, this does not come to public spending alone. National, regional, or local governments generally determine whether land is developed. This leads to an interesting philosophical question as to who owns any uplift in land value arising from permission to develop being granted, the landowner or the state. There is, of course, a large middle ground which affords possibilities for granting public benefit from still profitable private developments. And finally, the taxation of housing is often poorly designed and regressive, and there are good economic arguments for taxing land values. So housing affordability is an increasing challenge around the world. As well as affecting the lives of millions of households, it has implications for economic competitiveness and social, particularly intergenerational cohesion. There are no easy or short-term fixes, but effective solutions are likely to require us to regain a greater sense of individual responsibility and the collective good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was an absolutely masterful diagnosis of the international housing crisis. It was much more depressing, actually, than I'd hoped. But you did leave us with, I think it was seven ideas, which I'm going to recap for the audience, and then I'm going to jump into a question while you guys get warmed up, and we've got Mel here with the microphone. You did end, Mark, with an idea or some reasons for optimism. I think you used the terminology shifting the politically possible. And I think that's where I think many of us would like to get to in Australia. And you talked about those 7 ideas. One was around income support, and perhaps that is politically possible here in Australia, so that's one thing we could talk about. The second was around monetary policy, also incredibly topical right now in Australia. The third was about supply. Now that is always an important topic of conversation. I liked your framing of that as thinking of supply in the round, not just house building. The third one, of course, was the role of the social rental sector, and perhaps we could move to a politically possible mainstreaming of that. Let's discuss. Then next was around rent regulation, absolutely, completely topical, today. The sixth was around land value and the potential for value capture. So that is, again, something that we might consider. And the last, of course, was that old chestnut, how we tax housing. So with that, I've got a whole set of questions here that have been sent in, and we're going to alternate between you and questions from the audience. But to get us warmed up, we'll start with an easy one, Mark, and raise your hand if you've got a question. But an easy one from the audience. What would be your top 3 for Australia to address housing affordability?
Right, 3.
Put your hand up if you've got a question.
Well, I think rent assistance is something that seems to an outsider perhaps somewhat underdeveloped in Australia compared with, say Northwest Europe. I mean, the sort of typical arrangement in Northwest Europe, by which I mean Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, is to have a kind of 2-tier system. One is a kind of means something that's called a housing allowance that helps people who aren't right at the bottom, but it helps them with higher housing costs and moderates the impact of higher house or rents. But within the social assistance system, by which I mean the sort of baseline safety net, social security benefit, there is usually an allowance for enhancing that to prevent your income after your rent falling below this minimum level. Now, I think Australia is some way away from that with rent assistance, and it also seems to be a programme that's quite lacking transparency and difficult to understand. So I think that is probably an area, particularly given the kinds of stresses that people are under now, that might be looked at. I think social rented housing, is being revisited and should be revisited. But I think the important thing is that is to try and get long-term commitment to it, because a short-term programme isn't really going to make very much difference given the scale of the problem. So be looking to try and extend that over the period. And I think the third area that not just Australia, I think most countries need to confront is the taxation of housing, which is just simply, as I said in my talk, both regressive and poorly designed. So I think that those would be my top 3.
Thanks, Mark. All right, first question. Yes. Just there, Mel. You will need you to speak into the mic.
Hello, thank you. Point 6, if you could expand on that. I've got an example from the Central Coast of New South Wales where somebody had 10 acres and couldn't get it rezoned for development, so sold it and bought a house, and they sold it for half the price that they bought a house. So a house on, a normal house block. And it was just up the road from 10 acres that they sold for less than half of the price of the house. But a developer came along and made millions out of that 10 acres because they managed to get it rezoned, whereas the normal family couldn't do it, didn't know how to do it.
Right.
So your 0.6.
Yeah, so if you could tell us more perhaps about how other jurisdictions approach that question of betterment capture when land is redeveloped or when planning permissions are issued.
Yes, I mean, in the UK, this has been the modern planning system was brought in 1947, and there's been consensus on having a planning system, but where there's been a massive divide is over land value capture. About that point I made about, who owns the uplift in the value of the land. Is it the landowner because they own it, or is it the state because they own the development rights? And the initial view of the first Labour government after the war was that they owned all of it, so it was 100% tax. And curiously enough, not many people brought their land forward. So it kind of battled over that for years until eventually a kind of compromise was reached about 30 years ago, whereby when planning permission for housing is granted, there then follows a negotiation between the local planning authority and the developer about what contribution they might make to affordable housing, usually on the site. And of course the negotiation is over how much of that uplift in land value is there and how much can it be, how much can be attributed to housing. Now there are some people who say that system, well, if you actually do the sums, there's a lot of land value that isn't captured. But on the other hand, it's endured for 30 years. There is largely political consensus about it. And in England, where there's not very much government subsidy for social housing, half of new social housing that is provided is delivered through that mechanism. So it kind of saved social housing or new social housing in England. A sort of another model which, in very general and simplified terms, is how I understand it works in Germany, is that local government effectively purchases land at use value, puts in infrastructure and services, and then sells it to developers, and that's another mechanism for capturing the uplift in the land value. It's also how the British new towns effectively operated in the 40s and 50s, and seemed to work quite well there. In the UK, there's a debate about whether that is consistent with property rights under human rights, which I'm not sure has been fully resolved.
Feel free to put up your hand, otherwise, yep, okay, we've got a question there.
Thank you for that very interesting overview. I'm interested in all the different approaches and changes, and you've identified those 6 areas there. And of course, we've got a particular context here, particularly in relation to rental, which is quite unique in terms of really historically the only option was home ownership, etc., etc. Now, the question I have is, for the last 30-ish more years, the capacity of the government with its knowledge and skills and ability to move forward, in other words, to get the changes you're talking about, because basically our system is developer run, and the influence of the developers and their power, and the public service has been like denuded of its capabilities. I'm not saying there aren't some really good people in there. However, its capacity in terms of the rules around finances, asset management, etc., have basically stripped it of its capacity to do the social part of it. In other words, food, water, shelter, and including it in that model, if you like, of a right rather than a market commodity. How long is it going to take to get the shift? Simple question.
About 7.5 years. I mean, this question of influencing and change, is something that has troubled me for, many years. I mean, I became an academic about 30 years ago with some kind of, ideal that informed research would inform policy and change the world for better. We've had periods. I think during the last UK Labour government, the Blair-Brown government, there was an interest in evidence-based policy, as they called it, and I did chair an expert panel within the government department that was a kind of fast-track way of bringing in academic research to solve, or to address particular policy questions, but they tended to be at the kind of operational or very technical level, so it didn't shift any kind of the main parameters of policy. Another area that I've been interested in is reforming property tax, which in the UK is very unfair and regressive. I've reached the conclusion that we really don't need any more research reports proving that it's regressive and terrible, because it's not going to shift the dial, and we need to become much more involved with how we get from A to B. I think we need very long time horizons, perhaps, for some of these fundamental changes. I mean, I think in some of these big policy areas, 20 or 30 years is not an unrealistic time frame. But if it's going to be maintained for that long, then of course it's got to weather the vagaries of changing in governments and so on. So kind of consensus building mechanisms seems to me to be very, very important, and there is kind of work on this. There are two approaches I can think of. One is kind of deliberative methods, which is intended to kind of gain consensus amongst population, I suppose. Another is, some countries, Ireland springs to mind, I think the Scandinavian countries do too, have kind of quasi-corporatist bodies that bring together different interest groups and try and reach agreement on difficult issues, so that it might move forward. So I really don't have any easy answers, but that's my state of thinking on these difficult issues.
Okay, great. We've got a question here. Wendy? Yep, put up your hand so Mel can see you. And then we've got a question here.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. So my question's taking you to how you get the change. And just in the work that you've done, have you seen institutional frameworks that have actually helped make the systems change? Here in Australia it's particularly difficult because of the levels of government. But even in the area that I work in at the federal level, it's so fragmented. So even if you want change, it's often very difficult to know whose responsibility is to drive it. So are there models of institutions in different countries that might give us a pointer here?
Well, the thing there I can speak with some direct insight as some of the changes that we've had in Scotland, where the housing policy and the housing system was pretty much the same as in the rest of the UK at the point that the Scottish Parliament was re-established 25 years ago, and it's now changed quite a lot. So we have this commitment to social housing, we've house building programme, we have the extension of homelessness duties to local authorities, so they're now very wide, and we have reforms in the private rented sector so we now have security of tenure. There are no mandatory grounds for eviction. We've just had a rent cap. We're having some form of rent regulation being developed now. whether all that's sensible is a different question, but these changes have happened, and right to buy, as I said, have ended. Now, these were things that weren't really regarded as being politically possible even, I would say, 10 years ago, and that something has shifted. And I think the circumstances are probably these. One is, I think, a small jurisdiction helps. So, of course, you have a federal system, so you can think of the two levels. Scotland's population is only 5.4 million. So it's it's not many people you need to know to get fairly high up in government. The second is, it clearly helps where the sort of political landscape is kind of permanently centre-left. So there are two parties competing over it, but both are roughly the same. So there's a kind of stability there. I think a third thing is the NGO sector is very, very strong, and so is capable of lobbying persistently. And I think the way in which I think all Scottish governments since devolution have operated is that they have done it through a kind of quasi-corporatist mechanisms, that they bring all these groups together. I was on one of these Build Back Better type groups during the pandemic, and all the groups, NGOs, homeless, social housing, private landlords association, they were all there, and so you could develop policies that had agreement that were then relatively easy to implement. But that's my only insight. I think dealing with bigger jurisdictions is clearly more difficult. From the right, I suppose, in the UK, the think tanks that are immensely powerful on the right and have long-term direct relationships with the Conservative Party, so they are able to drive through quite radical changes to get things that were marginal into the mainstream. And I don't think we've seen anything like that on the other end of the spectrum.
It's an exciting model to think about. We're going to have time for one more question after this. So, okay, it's over there. Got it.
You touched on briefly the requirement in the UK for 20 to 40% affordable housing in new developments. I guess I'm interested as to if you know much about how that was sort of incepted and what the boiling point was for that legislation to come in.
Sorry, the what point?
Sort of like the boiling point for that change. As particularly in New South Wales, there's very minimal legislation for affordable housing or social housing. It's literally a guideline, and developers obviously are not always keen to follow guidelines. So I am seeing that Sydney will be heading pretty similarly to the way London was in terms of housing crisis. And so, yeah, I'd be interested as a case study if you knew much about it.
Well, the legislation was 1990 that formalised this, but it grew out of ad hoc practice at a local authority level, and I think it was really what happened is that the budgets of local authorities, particularly infrastructure budgets, got really squeezed. So they started using a rather obscure clause in an early 1970s act to start negotiating with developers for infrastructure whose need arose from a development, say a road or whatever, from that particular development. So and that just grew in an ad hoc way, and it was kind of like formalised. I think the really interesting thing, and I don't know whether it was how it happened or how deliberate it was or what on the housing thing, is that if you think about it, it's the idea was to use the uplifted land value to help pay for spillover effects or costs that were imposed on the community by the development. Now, using it to pay for social housing doesn't seem to me to be an obvious spillover effect. So it's a kind of fudge which everyone seems to be happy to work around. Which is sometimes the best way. Sometimes it's maybe the best way.
And we've got a final question over there, Chris.
Thanks. Chris Johnson's my name. I'm intrigued about an article I read in today's Herald talking about the average cost of an apartment in Sydney is now about 700,000. The average cost of a house is 1.4 million, double the amount. So the tension we've got in our city, and I'm interested in international examples that might have handled this before, is between people moving to the more affordable form of housing of apartments away from the house, which has been the traditional way for the suburbs and Sydney-siders to live, and the big tension that now happens between those in the suburban community seeing this more urban community emerging at half the price per unit, and a different lifestyle, one that's more sharing as opposed to everything in your own unit. And therefore a more urban lifestyle versus a more suburban lifestyle. I sense that European cities have moved past that point some time ago. But how have cities managed this tension between moving from an individual house, low rise, to a higher rise, more urban character?
That's a really fascinating question. Historically, the European or continental European cities, built flats, apartments. So the kind of low density suburbanized model that you see in English-speaking countries wasn't the historic case. So I suppose there was already a kind of cultural acceptance or preference even for that, and it became. That kind of model, the idea of densifying cities, became very fashionable in the UK, certainly probably elsewhere in the 90s. So under the Blair government, there was a kind of move to try and, I think it was compact cities they called it, and there was a material change, and that was that they changed the planning system, and the guidance was that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was to specify a mix of flats over houses. So there's a much higher level of flat building that was required, and that actually happened. So it wasn't necessarily fantastic quality, I might say, but but those developments in English cities in the 90s and early 2000s were much more dense than anything that had gone before. That's the only example of obvious change I can think of.
Look, very regretfully, we're going to need to leave this part of the evening here. I think we've been extremely lucky to have had the benefit of hearing that incredibly rich and yet amazingly succinct research-informed analysis of the international housing system. I also want to give a plug for our next event in this series. We've got Professor Declan Redmond coming from University College Dublin on the 18th of May, and he is actually going to talk about planning reform in the context of housing crisis, and the Irish situation is absolutely fascinating. So we're kind of going to be moving from an international stroke national scale of analysis to more the kind of state level, for us at least in Australia, the sort of state level hand-to-hand combat that is sometimes engaged with when it comes to the role of planning in relation to housing. I also want to note that a number of people put in some really fantastic housing questions, not all of which obviously we could get to tonight or get to Mark, but I want to, as we unfold now and get back to live events, we'll be continuing those housing conversations over the year, so please keep engaging with us. But for now, let's continue the conversation outside, and before we do, please join me in thanking us.